Good morning, brethren. It's good to see you this morning. Take your Bible and turn to the book of James, and we'll be in chapter 4 to start this morning. James chapter 4. And we were talking last week in chapter 4 in verses 1 through 12 about the evils of worldliness. Before we get to that, let me remind you, David and Kristen, brother and sister Gullidge, are in Little Rock this weekend visiting his family, giving his folks and his siblings an opportunity to get better acquainted with baby Woodson. And so, if you would be so kind, do keep them in your prayers as they're traveling this week. In James chapter 4, we noted that there are 3 sections to that first part of the chapter that we talked about last week. The source of the conflict that existed among some of the Christians. And it's important that we remember that the target audience for the book, the letter written by James, is Christians. It's not addressed to non-Christian people. And when James talks about war and fighting and challenges, difficulties, conflict, friction between the folks, he's talking about within the church, the source of the conflict. And then he talks about the cure for the conflict in verses 5 through 10. And here's where we had left off last week, a warning at verses 11 and 12 about that conflict. And that warning in verses 11 and 12 has to do with judgment. Who are you, Christian, to judge someone else's servant? Now, back in chapter 4, verses 5 through 10, James had talked about a whole host of good qualities. Submit to God, resist the devil, draw near to God, cleanse your hands, purify your hearts, and so on and so forth. In verse 11, verse 12, you have the negative counterpart to those qualities. It says, one who judges his brother, speaks against his brother, speaks against the law. Steve, our PowerPoint is, there we go, okay. Speaking evil is a reflection of what's in the heart. Speaking evil against your brother, setting yourself up as judge of your brother is a reflection of what's in your heart. And notice what James points out. One who judges his brother judges the law, sets himself up in place of the law. And that, my friends, is one of the chief problems or chief challenges that 21st century Christians must confront. Because the world around us, the society in which we live, is not bashful about sitting in judgment on God, about sitting in judgment on His Word. Our society is not at all embarrassed to present itself and its own values as the measure of all things, the standard by which everything else, including God, should be measured. If God doesn't like it, God's going to have to change, is the attitude of the modern world. But you go to verse 12, and the application James makes in all of this, going all the way back to verse 1 and really back into chapter 3, is we are not the source of law. We're not the source of right and wrong. We talked about the function of law last week, how that the function of law, the activity of law, is to identify, to distinguish right from wrong, to identify wrong and compare it to what's right. Well, we're not the source of that. Now, in much of the world, especially in the Western world, but in much of the world, civil government is aggressively divorced from any kind of religious morality. Our own Constitution is actually a little bit unique. Our founding documents, Declaration of Independence and Constitution, are actually a little bit unique in that respect, in that they take into account belief in the existence of the divine. Go to Mexico, however, and the Mexican Constitution, while it is a democratic document, that is, it enshrines democratic principles, it states that it is specifically a secular government, that it is not to be influenced by religious teaching. The Indian Constitution for the nation of India purports to set up a secular government enfranchising plurality or freedom of religion. Now we see that in India, the Hindu political party holds power and is enforcing aspects of that in spite of the Constitution. But most of the world would hold up religious influence and measure it against human influence. James makes the point here, when it comes to the church, when it comes to relationships between Christians, I'm not the standard. You're not the standard. We don't get to measure each other against ourselves. Now, turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 for a moment and just notice at verse 10. We talked a little bit last week in Acts 17 verses 30 and 31 how on Mars Hill in Athens, Paul points out that God is going to judge the world by Jesus. He's the standard. He's the measure. In 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 5 and verse 10, Paul says to the Corinthian Christians, we must all appear or all be present before the judgment seat of Christ to receive the things done in the body, whether good or bad. Go over to Galatians chapter 6 and notice in verses 1 and 2 the admonition there. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, in a trespass, you who are spiritual, there's a distinction there between the one overtaken in the trespass, in the sin, and the one who is spiritual. What's the difference? What's the distinction? The one overtaken was caught off guard. He's caught by surprise. He wasn't looking for the opportunity to sin, but he did sin. He stumbled, and so he fell. You who are spiritual, well, what's spiritual? That doesn't equate to flawless. It doesn't equate to sinless in every respect, but rather to one who is focused, one who is alert, unlike the one who stumbled. You who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of meekness. Why? Why be meek about it? Why not be arrogant? Because it could just as well have been us. It could just as well have been the spiritual one who might have stumbled. Considering yourself, lest you also be tempted, bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Go to Matthew chapter 5, look at verses 41 to 46. And in the judgment picture that Jesus paints there, the only thing that distinguishes the sheep from the goats is their response to the same, shall we call it, the same stimuli, the same opportunities. So, Pick up at James chapter 4 at verse 13. And the rest of this chapter, this brief little paragraph, says in essence, don't leave God out of your plans. The book of Ecclesiastes, 12 chapters in the Old Testament, found among that section of the Old Testament that's typically described as wisdom literature. It's not the law, and it's not prophecy per se. It falls into the same category as Psalms and Proverbs and Lamentations and so forth. What is Ecclesiastes? What does it show us? Go ahead, Dale. It shows wisdom. It chronicles Solomon, the wisest of all ordinary humans. It chronicles Solomon's search for the meaning and the purpose of life in this world. Why are we here? Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? And Solomon, with all of the world's resources at his disposal, sought for meaning, purpose, in pleasure, in power, in influence, in indulgence. And how does he summarize, as he draws this all together, how does he summarize the whole purpose of man at the end of the book? In Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14, as Dale started to say, this is the sum. This is what it's all about. I've examined everything. This is the end of the matter. All hath been heard. Fear or reverence God and keep His commandments. Why, Solomon? Because it's God who will bring every deed, every work into judgment, and not just those things that are known, but also every secret thing, whether good or evil. So James, in many respects, the New Testament counterpart in content to the writings of Solomon, to the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, James tells us in chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, as Christians, don't leave God out of your plans. Now, it seems that some of the Christians that James addresses here must have thought, we don't have to worry about God. We're Christians. God takes care of us, and so we don't have to think about it. We just go on and do whatever we want to do. Well, look at verse 13, and James says you need to always take God's will into account. In verse 13, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Go to now, ye who say, come on. Seriously? James is asking. They seem to have thought in Christ we can just do as we please. We can go on about our business. God will take care of everything. Well, nobody has a lease on this life. Which one of us is guaranteed 70 or 80 years? Moses in Psalm 90 writes in verse 10, 70 or 80 years, 70, or if by reason of strength, 80, and I fly away. Now, which one of us is guaranteed that many years? Not a one of us. Not a one of us. In our announcements this morning is mention of a Christian family, not in the immediate area, but in the metro Atlanta area, friends of one of our sisters here who were involved in an automobile accident this past week. The father was severely injured. One of the children was injured. The mother died. And we're talking about folks probably in their 40s. They weren't anticipating being in an accident. They weren't anticipating her abrupt departure, but it took place. 70 or 80 years? Maybe. All things being equal, but even that's not guaranteed. No person has a lease on life. Nobody can argue with God, it wasn't my time. There's nobody who's exempt from God's will. But look at verse 14. Here, James tells us this is what life's really like, the true nature of life in this world. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. Now, this is March 31st, 2024. Tomorrow is National Atheism Day. I heard one person snicker, one person got it. Tomorrow is the National Atheist Holiday. That's right, and two people got it. April 1st. The fool hath said in his heart there is no God. Assuming tomorrow comes. Assuming tomorrow comes and each of us awakens tomorrow. We have no guarantee tomorrow will be here. Go ahead, Dale. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, he stands against, yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. All y'all who say yes. Where they were going to go, yeah. Yeah. Yep. Exactly. Point well taken. These folks, Christians, were falling into the world's snare, not taking God into account. Now, let's back up one step from the points that Dale just made and consider, as we've noticed also with Paul's letter to the Galatians, here also in the book of James, what is part of the backdrop of the struggles that are causing problems for these Christians? Go ahead, Hugh. Exactly. The influence of some infiltrating the church, whether maliciously or ignorantly, with Jewish perspective, Jewish teaching. Now, it's very clear in Paul's letter to the Galatians, because the Galatian churches were mixed congregations. They had some Jews, they had predominantly Gentile Christians. James addresses his letter primarily, foremost, to Jewish Christians. And James is actually writing this letter in the same general time frame that Paul writes the letter to the churches of Galatia, which would be in the late 40s, early 50s. So roughly 15, 16, 17, 18 years after Pentecost at the most. James writes to these Christians who are being impacted, these primarily Jewish Christians, being impacted by this doctrine, this teaching. And what's part of the problem they confront, unlike the Galatian churches? The focus in Paul's letter to the Galatians is on combating those who are trying to, in effect, corrupt the faith of Gentile Christians in the Galatian churches, saying, yes, you have salvation by grace, but you need to add this on top of that in order to be really righteous with God. James is addressing folks whose roots, whose backgrounds were in Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish practices. And given that setting, what was their background, their culture of action toward God? We're God's people. And we're already assured of God's favor. And we can just go on about our business and do what we want to do, as it were. The Gentile Christians had to struggle with having their faith altered from what they'd originally been taught by these Judaizing teachers. Some of these Jewish Christians now have to struggle with not bringing into their Christianity the attitudes and the prejudices and the carelessness that had characterized their practice of Judaism. So, here in chapter 4, where he says, you need to consider, you need to recognize the true nature of life in this world. You need to not leave God out of your plans like you have been. He's making a distinction between the way they had perhaps practiced Judaism, going through the motions, and the way they needed to practice Christianity, which is from the heart. So, the proper perspective in this world, he says in verse 15, you ought to say. In other words, here's how you ought to think about it. If the Lord wills. It's not up just to you. Now, does that mean that we're just fatalists and we just coast through life and whatever happens, happens? Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. No. We do make plans, don't we? David, when you got up this morning, you planned to come to Bible class and worship, didn't you? I know that David planned because he's got his coat on, he's got his tie on. I saw his car in the parking lot before I got here. I knew that he'd made his plans. And lo and behold, here he sits in Bible class. Same thing with Gail, same thing with David and Sue, same thing with Paul and DeCita. We did make plans. Now, among those plans, what was present? Well, there's a possibility we might not get here. The world might end before we get finished this morning. Paul wrote to the Roman Christians about dealing with strife in the world. And he said, as much as in you lieth, Romans chapter 12, be at peace with all men. And in that statement is a recognition that some things are in our control, but some things are not. Those things that we do control, we need to handle responsibly. Those things that we don't control, we need to not worry about. So here, we make our plans. James didn't say it's wrong to plan to go into another city and stay there a year and trade and make a profit. He said it's wrong to do that without taking God into account, without considering the will of God. Life is, what is life really like? Here today and gone tomorrow. What is your life? It is but a vapor that appears for a little time and vanishes away. Over in Isaiah, in chapter 36, you pick up at verse 16 and read down through verse 20, and Isaiah recounts there what the Rabshakeh, the Assyrian emperor's general, says to the inhabitants of Jerusalem when the Assyrians are knocking on the gate in Hezekiah's reign, saying, "You need to surrender to us now." And in verses 16 through 20, in Hebrew, where everybody could understand, the Rabshakeh declares loudly to everybody, "Where is the God that's been able to stand against our gods? It's your God that sent us here," and so forth. Well, it was all false, because the gods of the Assyrians had done nothing for them. The gods of the Assyrians had empowered them in nothing, because the gods of the Assyrians didn't exist. How then did they have such immense power and success? How were they able to surround Jerusalem, having conquered all of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and carried them away into captivity? How could they come into the southern kingdom and threaten them? It wasn't by the power of their gods. It was by the power of the God that they were allowed to do that. Here, you ought to take into account, James says, God's will. You boast in your arrogance, verse 16. All such boasting is vain. Now, it's hard to step back and swallow this as addressed to brothers and sisters in Christ, isn't it? Because James is giving us a little glimpse of some qualities that are not very attractive in the lives of Christians. Even in the lives of Christians, we can find these unsavory attitudes, these selfish, unspiritual perspectives. And James writes these words warning us to guard against them. So you look at verse 17, and here's the general truth. Here's the overall principle. This is not just a proverb. This is a general truth for all of life. Whoever knows the right thing to do and doesn't do it commits sin. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not. The one who knows the right thing that he ought to do and persists in not doing it. There's a distinction between James 4 verse 17 and Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. In Galatians 6:1 that we talked about a minute ago, you have a Christian in view who encounters some temptation unexpectedly. Now, maybe he was not on guard when he should have been on guard. Maybe it's a case of carelessness on the Christian's part in Galatians chapter 6. Or It might be the case that here is brother so-and-so, and he's just going about his daily affairs. He's doing his best to live uprightly, and he's blindsided. It's not that he's not on guard against all those things that he anticipates, but here comes a temptation that he didn't anticipate. He wasn't looking for it, and because he wasn't alert to it, he stumbled. Walk down any urban sidewalk, downtown Atlanta, and what do you learn quickly? You better pay attention to where you're putting your feet. The ground shifts, and sometimes the expansion joints aren't level. You've got to watch where you're going. And if you don't watch where you're going, what's liable to happen? You may face plant on the concrete. That's Galatians 6 and verse 1. The difference between that and James 4 and verse 17 is that in James 4 and verse 17, we're talking about Christians, again, people who know the right thing to do. Here's where an understanding of older English grammar in the King James and the American Standard versions is actually a very helpful thing to our understanding. Because the way it's phrased there, see the English Standard, the modern 21st century rendering of that, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That's clear, but not entirely accurate. Because there's a nuance here that's screamingly obvious in the Greek text, but also obvious in the older English translations. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not. The old English verb form ETH, knoweth, doeth, thinketh, reflects a characteristic or a quality that knows and does muddies. ETH on the end of a verb means to think and continue thinking, to do and continue doing. It talks about a pattern of behavior, not a one-time action, but an action that continues. So here, James says the one who knows and continues knowing the right thing to do and does not and continues not doing it, to him it is sin. See, there's a difference. In Galatians 6, we have a one-time event. The brother just bebopping through life and stumbles. Wasn't looking for it, maybe didn't anticipate it when he should have, but regardless, a one-time event, caught off guard, sinned in that instant, and needs to be restored. But he did not continue in that sin. The distinction is that here in James chapter 4, as James has dealt with this issue of worldliness among the saints, he gets to the heart of it, and perhaps to the heart of some of the issues with the Judaizers, those folks that are trying to add Judaism's traditions and culture on top of the gospel, by pointing out the one who knows, continues to know what is right, and does not do and persists in not doing it, sins. There's a willfulness in verse 17 that is absent in Galatians chapter 6. There's an attitude present. Call it a stubbornness, if you will, in James 4, verse 17. I know what I ought to do, but I'm going to go on and do this anyway. I want to do this. Brother Paul and then Brother Dale. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The question, does this statement, this characteristic in James 4, verse 17 of willfulness, of call it stubbornness, if you will, does that impact what has been said in verses 13, 14, 15, 16, especially 13 and 14 of making plans and just not taking God into account? Absolutely. We know we ought to take God into account. Think of it this way. Most of us here are older adults. There are few of you young folks with us. But most of us have adult children. Some of us have adult grandchildren or even adult great-grandchildren. Would you advise your child to take a job in another city based solely on the income that they stand to make in that community? You know, if you move to the San Francisco area, you can make 4 times as much as you can make in Atlanta. But what's the moral environment like in the Bay Area? And how strong is the church? And how much impact could you have there? Now, is it wrong to move to the Bay Area? No. Is it wrong to multiply your annual income from $100,000 to $500,000? No. But are those the only considerations that matter? No. Do you really want to rear children in that environment? Do you really want to work where every word and every action is scrutinized and measured not against the morality of the Scriptures, but against the immorality of the world? Yes, go ahead. The question basically amounts to, should you be thinking in the back of your mind every moment, oh, this could be my last moment. I need to be thinking about. We're not talking about a moment by moment need to recognize, oh, this could be the end, this could be the end, this could be the end, this could be the end. But rather a recognition that in all of our thinking, all of our planning, all of our living, we take that into account just as we do everything else. It is a dominant, it's not the only thought, but it is a dominant influence for the Christian. Dale, you had, I didn't mean to skip over you. You had something to add as well. Yep. Except, there you go. There you go. For boasting, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Mm-hmm. They weren't prepared. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 And not hearers only, exactly. Yep. Well, think about, you're correct in this. Think about Jesus' words in John chapter 8. As Jesus is, shall we say, sparring with the Pharisees and the scribes, what comes out there? Their attitude. Why, we're Abraham's seed. We've never been in bondage to any man. We're God's people. In other words, we're assured. We've got it made. We're the perfect people. How easy would it be for Jewish Christians to bring that same attitude into the church? If I've got it made, if everything is taken care of in Christ, then what's left for me to do? Well, I just go on about my business, do my little thing, whatever I want to do, and I don't worry about any of that. You know, there is a 21st century counterpart in Christendom to the attitude that we see here in James chapter 4. And that lies in Reformed and Calvinistic theology that basically says God has done everything that needed to be done. So if we're saved, we're saved. We can just go on about our business. We can't be lost if we try. And if we're lost, we couldn't get saved if we wanted to. It's all on God and none on us, which makes a mockery of, as Dale pointed out, James' admonition, be doers of the word, practitioners of the word, and not just hearers. Here's the problem that these Christians needed to confront. You've got to practice your faith. He says in verse 17, do good, not in the sense of doing good deeds, of stacking up a checklist of, I did this, I did this, I did this. That's not the point here, but rather knowing how to act in a way that's morally excellent. Knowing how to act, boasting, to borrow Paul's word, in the cross of Christ, and not in, look who I am. Have you ever known an arrogant Christian? And I don't mean someone who is a Christian who is arrogant about what school they went to or which sports team they root for or what kind of job they have, but someone who is arrogant about being a Christian. That's who James is describing here. Well, jump into chapter 5, and I really had anticipated being most of the way through chapter 5 this morning, but that's all right. Jump into chapter 5 for just a moment and notice there's no break in thought between chapter 4 and chapter 5. This is just a continuation of the same line of thinking. And he says, "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you." Now, go back into chapter 4. We're going to go spend a year in this town and trade and make a profit. You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll live and do this or that. You need to take God into account. You need to recognize that you don't control every detail of your life. Come now, you rich. Weep, howl for the misery that's coming upon you. I want to point out something, and this will make a good place for us to conclude this morning, but I want to point out something here at the beginning of chapter 5. Those who are rich in this world's goods are oftentimes the objects of heaven's scorn. Those who are materially wealthy are often, not always, but they're often the object of divine scorn. Why? Well, heaven has nothing of which to be jealous. Brother Paul? Mm-hmm. Okay. There are obligations they never seem to meet because they're more focused on money than God. Okay. Well, there's no sin in being rich. God made Abraham rich. God made Solomon probably the only trillionaire in history. Don't know that it was necessarily a favor to him, considering how it turned out. But the other side of that coin is there's no virtue in being poor. It doesn't matter if I'm rich or poor materially. Why would the wealthy in this world's goods be objects of divine scorn? Yes, he will. James will explain this in verse 4, as Dale says. The reason